Welcome, welcome. Lots of folks are connecting. It's good to see all these folks out there. Thanks for joining us. My name is Gibson Fay LeBlanc, and on behalf of Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance and Longfellow Books, excited to get our event started out. There's not really too much to say. You should be on mute, as you probably know. You've probably been to some Zoom events already. And so I am going to introduce both of our poets here tonight, and then we will get into reading and conversation. Without further ado, I just want to say this is a big pleasure for me tonight. Because I've worked with both Stuart Kestenbaum and Deborah Cummins in different capacities for a long time, and on different things. Stu, as you probably know, has been the Maine State Poet Laureate for his term is wrapping up early in 2021. So he's just at the tail end of it. And he and I have had a chance to work together on a number of his projects that are bringing poetry to all corners of Maine. And he is the author of 5 collections of poems, including most recently, How to Start Over. He was also the director of Haystack Mountain School for many years. And you probably know he does Poems from Here on Maine Public Radio as part of his Poet Laureate duties and projects. So big welcome to Stu. And also joining us tonight, our featured person tonight. We are here to celebrate Deborah Cummins and her new book, Until They Catch Fire, which you might notice over my shoulder here. Look at that, product placement, there it is. Deborah has been the board president of Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance for a bunch of years, and she and I have worked together on many things over the last bunch of years. And she happens to be a poet that I deeply admire. I'm really happy to do this here tonight. And this is her 3rd book of poems. And she also has a book of essays. And I think that's all I'm gonna say. So I'm gonna bring Deborah and Stuart forward, and we will get into our conversation. Hello, everybody.
Hey, right. Thanks, Gibson.
Yeah, my pleasure.
That was the slickest product placement that I can ever remember. Just reaching back and grabbing that book was really something. First, I wanted to thank Longfellow Books. I'm imagining us all in that kind of long space in Longfellow Books gathered here for Deborah's reading, at least in our minds. And if you want to order copies of the book, which I know you will, you can order them right through Longfellow Books. The other thing is to thank Deerbrook Editions and Jeff Haste, because he has been publishing so much poetry in Maine, many books by Maine writers, but writers from elsewhere as well. And it's a really, having books in the world helps people read your work. And it's a critical part of what happens with writing. So the way this will work is that Deborah and I will have a conversation. We realize we're both on Deer Isle, that I could actually leave when she's reading and show up at her house right over her shoulder. But with COVID, we're not gonna do that. We're gonna stay a mile away from each other. I just wanted to talk about, for me, the book has such a sense of dealing with grief and loss, but also coming to a kind of understanding. And as I was reading it today, I just wanted to start out by reading a stanza from the poem, After Flying Home from the Funeral, and then ask Deborah some questions. But this is the middle stanza of a poem. So I know I shouldn't be excerpting stanzas from poems, but since the poet's here, I think it's okay. And since you're all going to buy the book, it's okay as well. And it says, she talks about coming home and she writes, "The sentence I didn't expect to write. My brother died with his eyes open, stated with authority, and proving what? That I now have currency in the domain of death and grief, no longer a mere visitor to the terrain of loss." And when I read that, Deborah, it felt like that, feels like that was almost like the stanza within the book that says something essential about the book. Did you, how did you think about like kind of organizing the book, and it seems like grief was a major driving factor for you?
Well, yes, it was, it is. And it's interesting that you should point out that particular stanza and call that to my attention. It's one of the shorter poems in the book, actually. But my book is really central to my book are two seminal events in my life. Some years ago, the death of my 45-year-old brother, and also 10 months later, my mother. And so that's really at the heart of the book. So indeed, there is an emphasis, an exploration of grief and loss. And I think of the book in a way as my journey through grief and through coming to maybe not terms with it, but going through it and living with it, but also at the same time appreciating the passage of time, the role of memory, of what remains, a deep gratitude for what remains, and how moving through that experience. Of course, my hope is, while this is a very personal journey, that it has some universality, which we all hope for as poets and writers, and that other people will understand and perhaps recognize some of their own experiences with grief and loss.
Right.
So yeah, so I guess those questions that I put forward, and I think that was in the first section of the book, are
Right.
things that I then go on to explore.
Yes, and well, maybe could you read us a poem now? Read the Griever's Reference Manual, since
Sure.
that will give us a guide.
This poem, I read many books as I prepared, as I thought about putting this collection together. And one book I went back to is Marie Howe's, the poet Marie Howe's book, What the Living Do. And I was always struck, and it's long remained a favorite poem of mine, which is the title poem, What the Living Do. And so I think my Griever's Reference Manual, which is kind of a direct address, was a little bit informed by her poem. But I think hopefully readers will recognize some of their own experiences, those conflicted feelings when you're going through deep grief and what happens to you, including at times anger, those different places you go to. A Griever's Reference Manual. Prepare pancakes. Forget to flip them until they're scorched discs. Eat when you have no appetite. Compose emails that are never sent. Realize with the open book on your lap, you've read the same paragraph 3 times and can't remember a single word. Kick the shovel that refuses to stay propped in the garden shed. Fling a pot lid to the floor when it won't fit back into the drawer. When your printer jams, at last allow your husband to step in, save it from imminent destruction. At your desk, a blank page. At the mirror, oddly, you still look normal. Wonder why the phone doesn't ring. Hate it when the phone rings. Reject euphemisms, a lexicon of laid to rest and at peace, trying to make death more palatable. Discover the almost infinite ways to play if only. Admit that if only, in the if only game, There weren't so many occasions to use better and harder, especially in conjunction with the verb try. Vow never to tell anyone, time will heal, or life goes on. Above all, reject the simplicity of metaphors, a flame, a wall, the sea. There is nothing to keep alight, climb, swim through to get to the other side.
Thank you. You know, I really appreciated the line of vow to never tell anyone, time will heal, or life goes on. In Judaism, there's I guess a practice with mourners is that you don't speak to the mourner until the mourner speaks to you. So it's not the mourner's obligation to have to comfort the person who wants to comfort you, which I think is a great practice. So you don't have to deal with people saying, yeah, life goes on, things like that. But you know, as you were reading it, I was thinking, where you end with to reject the simplicity of metaphor. For a poet to say that, you could lose your poetic license.
There you go.
Yeah.
I wondered about that.
What did but you know, I mean, it's an interesting play because in a way metaphor helps us understand by making an image that connects us. But what were your thoughts then when you were writing that?
I don't remember. I mean, in a way, it's just like, I guess overall is simplicity, that there's just a way of looking at moving through grief, that there's just that wall to get over, or that you got to find the light, or it's not that simple. I guess I'm rejecting the simplicity more than the metaphor.
Right.
But it's just the idea that it's not that simple. It's really the simplicity part that I'm getting at.
And, you know, I was thinking about the structure of this poem, like once you had think of it almost like an architecture of this poem, like you could fit things in there. I mean, it's like, well, it's a reference manual. So it gives you an opportunity to kind of give instructions. Is that what came first? Like you just thought, I think I'll write a manual. Is that what drove it?
I think originally, I had it a title that had instruction in it, and it was kind of a self-instruction in a way. It's like what I was going through, and I started out, I think actually, because I always start my poems in pencil. I don't put them on the computer, and it's a while before I actually put them on the computer. And I think I just started making a list of them. Some of the things I had experienced. I mean, that part about flinging the pot lids and the shovel and the printer, I mean, I hate to say it, those really were happening. And the puzzlement over that, you know, and like, what is happening to me? So part of it was kind of a discovery for me too.
Yeah, it's a very tender moment when your printer jams and
Right.
allow your husband to step in.
That's right.
Like to recognize
That's right.
you can be so deeply inside grief. You know, you can lose track of where you are, I think.
Right. And you know, and I think one of his greatest gifts was to be hands off when it was necessary. Not necessarily to step in, but he was always there, but sometimes knew to step back and kind of hands off, that I was going through a process.
And when you, I remember in your book of essays, they came out of, probably 6-7 years ago, maybe more than that. Yeah,
it's been a while, right?
You wrote about your brother's death in that.
Yeah, I did. I think I surprised myself in one of the essays, and I can't remember which one it was, but he appeared in it. And when I was writing that book, it was about the time, putting that book together, and those essays I was writing, it was about the time he died. It was in summer. And so I didn't dwell on it a lot. It was in that one essay, but yes, I did write about it. And I think I had mentioned to you a little bit, Stu, that when I first started contemplating, I knew I had to write about this in some way. because as I said, they were seminal moments and they shaped so much of my life at the time and in many ways since. And I thought it was going to be prose. I started out writing in prose. And I actually thought that perhaps it would be linked essays, such as my last book was. And then as I got into writing it more, it began to be more like a memoir, or even perhaps nonfiction, narrative nonfiction. And so I worked on it a long time in that way. But at some point, and I don't remember when it was, but it was well into working on this, I really craved and felt like I needed the distillation of poetry to get at certain things. And so then I turned to poetry, and there were some books that were very important to me. I always read other authors I admire for a lot of reasons, but for example, in addition to Marie Howe's book, Mary Jo Bang's Elegy, Ed Hirsch's Gabriel about the death of his son, the late Jane Mead's book about her mother's death, Made and Unmade. And that just started telling me, that I really needed to write poetry about it. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just say that, but it was prose that gave me one of my favorite prose writers, Patricia Hampel. She has written poetry. I don't think she does so much now. It's mostly prose. I came upon some lines of hers that became the epigraph to the book. And I'd like to read those because they do inform the way I think about this book. And those lines are: the dry twigs of a vanished life, whatever its fullness once was, are rubbed together until they catch fire, until they make something, until they make a story. And from those lines, I got the book's title, Until They Catch Fire. And I'm hoping they do tell a story. I'd like to think that these poems are those dry twigs that when they're rubbed together, perhaps hopefully in the ordering, they resonate with one another, that they do tell a kind of story. And I've really come to think of this collection as a memoir in poetry. I mean, I thought I was going to write a memoir in a way I feel I still have, but it's in poetry.
And, it's interesting. I was thinking how, the death of a sibling is, you can always go back to those kind of first memories, like growing up in the same house and things that kind of forever time of childhood. That's actually not that long given the trajectory of lives, whatever those 10 years when everybody's together in the house. But that you have some poems that are specifically about your memories of your house being built, your dad building your house. Your brother doesn't figure in that really, but it felt to me like it evoked this time. Like,
he wasn't born yet.
you can't imagine a time without that sibling, because you were like a family unit, and then and he's the first one gone.
Yeah, and he was the youngest.
Right.
Yeah.
And even in the poem Last Photo, when you don't, that's like that last capture of memory, then you don't know it's the last. Would you like to read that?
Last Photo? Sure.
Yeah.
I think that's in the first section, right? Yeah.
Yeah, page 15.
Yeah, those moments when you don't realize that they are. And I should say that my brother and his family and my parents all lived in Arizona. They moved there many, many years ago. I was out of college and had a job in the city in Chicago. I'm originally from Chicago, and I stayed behind and they moved there. And my brother was only 9, I believe, when he moved. But anyway, I'd go back to Arizona, and this was one of those occasions before his death. He was ill at the time that this poem, I think, makes clear. Last Photo. Taken moments after my brother pulled into the parking lot to meet us, unfolded himself from his little Mazda, attempted to camouflage pain. Thinner now, but his skin more tan than jaundice yellow, his cheeks fleshed out, hair trimmed, freshly washed. His quick smile, the familiar quick, hard hug. Before he'd have lifted me off my feet, but none of that now, the quick gone out of it. Beneath my encircling arms, his shoulder bones jutted, my hands unable to retrieve the fit young man, skier, marathon runner, hiker of mountain and desert. The photo I had to take that instant, as though time itself, unstoppered, was running out, opportunities draining away. Of mother, father, son, backdropped against the Arizona restaurant's tangle of pink bougainvillea, taunting with obscene abundance. The three of them grinning, as if this were any occasion, as if in the months ahead, there'd be plenty of time for memorializing of the picture taking kind. Not once did I think, this is the last time we'll do this. It never entered my mind.
Thank you. I was thinking the Philip Booth has a poem called Saying It, where he talks about trying to say like the essence of a thing, you know,
Yeah.
saying it, trying to say it, to say what we mean. And I was thinking, you know, in a way, the book has lots of different takes on not saying the same thing, but getting at some same essence of your family, the lives of your brother and your mother and your dad too. When you were writing, what were some moments when you went somewhere where you thought, I had no idea when I started this out, you know, that this poem was going to end up here? You know, Robert Frost says about a poem should be like ice on a hot stove, allowed to ride on its own melting. You know, that you can't force it, that you're, and I'm wondering, like, were there particular poems you remember as ones where you thought it came from you when you got to the end of it, but you didn't know?
I think there's a couple of them. There's one poem called The New Order of Things. And it was when my mother was, she had been very ill at the time of my brother's death. She had actually had some emergency heart surgery. She'd had a stroke years before that, and then she had some emergency heart surgery. So she was in the ICU when my brother died, actually. And I remember saying to my sister at the time, I don't really think Mom is going to survive after her son, her youngest, died. And so she kind of, over the course of those 10 months, did go downhill, went from ICU to skilled nursing, eventually to long-term care. She couldn't go home again. And so there's a poem, The New Order of Things, where I talk about how things had changed, and that with my brother gone and how things had changed, there was this new order, particularly with me as the eldest sibling. And I get to a point at the end of that poem where the line was kind of, I didn't know where I was going, and then the line at the end is kind of a surprise to me.
Would you like to read that poem?
Sure, I can. Hopefully it'll be a surprise to you now after I said it is to the listeners. I've got to find it though, what section it's in.
I'll be looking with you.
Oh yeah, 63. I got it. It's in the final section. Yeah, the way the book is organized is the final section is where I deal more specifically with my mother's death. The New Order of Things. I'd become too easily convinced that to hug my mother risked some tube or catheter detaching, or that too frail she'd break. Never a family of big hugs or enfolding embraces, she'd long nurtured the belief that we were. Hard to remember a time, although surely there had to be one, when I was gathered to her, held, my face pressed against scratchy fabric or damp apron, and eyes shut, I nestled into that sudden warmth. A gesture I want suddenly to reciprocate after her nurse, ascribing it to bad dreams, tells me, your mother calls out in the night. With, I imagine, vivid, recurrent images of what in words she still refused to articulate. Or perhaps she woke into a fog without a bell buoy or horn to offer direction through a narrow passage, worn whether she was coming ashore or drifting out to sea. My mother, who'd lived through the death of her first newborn, now being asked to survive the loss of her son. While I, attending, no longer feel like my mother's child. In the new order of things, I could not be the child needing succor or guidance. I was older than my brother would ever be. Something new was now expected of me. The comforter, the one to steer through fog, the one to turn on the nightlight and beat back the dark. But am I even tall enough to reach the switch?
That was the last line was a line. That was, yeah,
I just didn't expect it to come there,
yeah,
or even the last few lines, but yeah.
yes, yeah. That kind of shift in roles that
Right.
you had. And then just a few poems beyond that on, I think it's Departed. It's also obviously a shift in roles. I feel like it's a great companion to the new order of things, because it's another new order, I guess. But would you read Departed?
Oh, sure.
And I should say, I love in the poem how you your close observation of things like catheters and PICC lines and all the medical paraphernalia that we never think we're going to get to know, and then we get to know.
Right.
In that world.
And I knew way more about it than I ever wanted to.
Yeah.
Because my dad kind of relied on me, and I ended up going out there a lot or being on the phone a lot and dealing with the doctors. He wasn't, he had a harder time. So I think he wanted me to step in. And so I did learn a lot more about all that than I expected. This poem was a little difficult. I think we all envision how we might experience the death of our loved ones, and that will be there. We picture a coming together at the end and how we want it to be. And of course, that isn't at all how it is. My brother died alone, collapsed in a shower at home. And my mother, I knew that she was fading. She was in hospice, and I flew out there immediately because all of a sudden things started happening real quick, which often happens. So I was, it's not the easiest thing to get from an island in Maine to Prescott, Arizona, which is about 90 minutes outside of Phoenix. So I flew out as soon as I could, but I didn't quite make it. So this poem, that's the background to how this starts. Okay. Departed. I missed it by an hour, the moment my mother slipped from is to isn't. I was witness only to the body that had held her dreams, secrets, and imaginings, had once held me. And now, dare I say it, was a vessel, her skull so prominent against flesh, it looked like her cheekbones threatened to escape, but her mouth only slightly agape, uncontorted, without grimace, evidence I needed, of no struggle, her body done, yielding. She'd have been grateful for, at last, her room's quiet. No special bed pump wheezed, No oxygen machines gurgled. Gone the catheter, PICC line, the elastic cuff holding in place all her needles and tubes. Would she have been aware in her last hours of final human touch kindnesses, how someone had rubbed her favorite lavender lotion onto her splotched hands, covered her with the blue quilt gifted by hospice? Where, though, was the pervasive spirit, an essence almost holy, I'd long been told succeeds us? Only an irrefutable, overwhelming absence. She'd not merely left her room, she'd not an insult of simplicity passed, nor in my eyes was she the departed, as if she'd only embarked on a journey, and our only task to see her off, say goodbye, be certain someone on shore waves flings kisses as the anchor is heaved, and we usher ourselves back into the living to lament, keen, and begin, or perhaps continue to regret. All those months, I never asked her if she was scared. I was afraid to.
Thank you. You know, I know when we were talking last week, I told you I was remembering when, after I read the book, that reading Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking, the Walt Whitman poem, and in it he says, oh, death, 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 death. And that my professor in college had commented that saying death 5 times made life easier. And I think there's a quality of that you just you stay with the passages out of the world, but I think it also makes you much more aware of being alive too.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that what it was so moving for me about the poem. I have to remember the title of it. The one I read on the radio that we just talked about.
Oh, trying to tell us.
Trying to tell us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which seems to me like recognizing both mortality and immortality in a way. I mean, the moment of being alive.
Well, and I do try for that journey aspect, that narrative arc, to move to that place. And I've tried to intersperse those poems, particularly in the 3rd and 4th sections, where I do recognize the loss, but also the deep gratitude for what remains, for what is still possible, and the living in the moment, and how grateful I am. And so I've tried to show that part of the journey also, getting to that place. And
Yes.
hopefully I kind of get to that place.
Yes. So, and since I read the poem, on the radio, when I do that, I try to actually, as best I can, kind of be inside, like imagine they're my words, to kind of bonding with,
Right.
like going on the inside of it in a way. So I feel like I'm friends with that poem. Maybe.
Good.
So, yeah. So would you read that one now?
Sure. And it's always such an honor to have you choose a poem of mine, Stu, and to listen to it. So this is actually kind of a love poem to my husband, Bob. That's who I'm addressing by my love in it. And particularly for those of us on Deer Isle might recognize some of the geographical references here, but it doesn't really particularly matter if you don't, but hopefully you can relate to it at a certain age. Trying to tell us, little by little, my love, the signs accrue. Our muscles forget their grace in the easiest maneuver. We swim half as far out as strength once enabled. More breathlessness climbing Russ's hill. For those of us discovering late who and what we love, there is no reprieve from how the body betrays us, or how the mind comprehends that it all begins with the body. Hands, eyes, belly, lips that kiss, tongue that tells. Already, somewhere, paths seem mapped out for us. But isn't the going fragrant, sweet? Unaware of age, our blood still hums. Remember, love, how once we stayed out in the cold, skating the slick frozen river until frostbite numbed our fingers and toes. And after the red ache of warming, our bodies trying to tell us we're dying, we're still alive.
I love those last lines.
Thank you.
Yeah. When you were writing the book, I mean, you talked about it being a memoir and poems. Were there poems that you wrote once you had the structure? Like you said, oh, I need like if you're writing prose, you might say, oh, I need a section here I have to write, but I don't think of poetry as evolving in quite that way.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think I thought of it in that way. What did happen though, is it's really important to me how poems are ordered and structured, how a book is structured. You know, I think some people may think you put poems together, you know, but you really kind of, and in this case, I wanted to kind of tell a story, but also have the poems ordered in a way that they play off one another, they resonate, that there's some way that they move. And that's not only in the individual poems, but also in the sections, how I sectioned the book. That took a lot of work. And I did many revisions of that. And so I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but I was unhappy with it. Originally, I thought, okay, it'll be chronological. And that didn't seem to work. So then I went back and I really pulled apart the poems, and I recognized that there were certain poems that needed to be in there, surely, but some of them, and I thought they were good poems and I loved them, and some of them had been published, but they visited the same territory. They visited the same place and didn't offer enough new. So I had to start pulling them out. I had to say, okay, these 3 poems tell kind of the same thing, and so you know how difficult that is. It's
Right.
the old kill
Your
the darlings.
children, yeah.
Kill the darlings.
Yeah.
And so once I started doing that, I ended up with 4 sections instead of the original 3. But also what happened is I recognized that some of my older poems suddenly had a place in the manuscript, that they worked with some of the poems.
Right.
I hadn't intended it for this manuscript, but they just worked in terms of the resonance.
Yeah.
So that started happening. And then these older poems went in. In fact, the last poem of the book, Walking Shaw Prairie After the Burn, is my oldest poem in the book. It's actually from my chapbook, which was my first publication, and that's many, many years ago. But it just felt like it belonged there, and I still feel like it belongs there.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until after I felt very satisfied, and it wasn't until after this that I came to look at it and think, oh my, I've got a poem after the burn concluding the book that is titled Until They Catch Fire. And I mean, how that kind of came together, which was totally unintentional.
That kind of synchronicity. Well, I'm
Yeah.
looking, I think we're going to take questions in a little bit.
Oh,
So,
okay.
but before that, what I'd like you to do is you want to read the last poem, because it's a perfect, what's the perfect ending, because it's the last poem in the book, but I think kind of speaks to a journey to renewal.
Okay. So there is an epigraph where I explain what a controlled burn is. The fire is set to the ground layer of an area to burn off dead leaves and grasses and invigorate growth. Walking Shaw Prairie after the burn. All this black stubble powdered with ash. I need to remind myself it's not charred ruin, this obliteration of turkey footgrass, the giant blue stem, a sacrifice of seed head and nest. Suddenly in late March, a new nameless season, spring with autumn's burn, less spectacularly clothed. Green shoots will soon grow back, speak a new language. I don't know if I should be happy or terrified at how quickly things are replaced. But why the tinkering? Why not wait for lightning's bolt? Here, where every tree could be a coffin and clouds can darken anything they want. Ashes, I've instructed my family, wanting them to forget where they might otherwise take me. All those candled pillars, banked votives, the color of flesh, incense and plaster saints, cold painted flames sprouting from their pious breasts. A collective rising up before the putting under. Give me reliquary of ocean, mountain, marsh. I preferred the fire of a well-lived life, a dual study in what we want, what we cannot touch, a final flaring. And already, when I focus my attention, I see green stitches in the black, a mending of the visible by something immense, of what, renewed, rises again into this cathedral of light.
Pretty great that you had that poem in your back pocket, kind of, right?
I
you
know. And of course, it addresses another theme that runs throughout the book, which is my struggle with belief. Being raised to a certain age Catholic, and
Right.
I guess the polite way of saying it is I'm a lapsed Catholic, but that still stays with you a little bit. So
Just
that
a little, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, one thing we didn't, I don't know if they're, Gibson, if people have questions, would they put them in now? Because I have some other questions for Deborah if
Yeah, and I just thought I would jump in, and yes, if anybody has questions, they can put them in the chat, and we'll take what we can. And I have a couple of things that I want to ask you too. I feel like we've got the two of you here, so Stu, you should have to ask answers as well. Some
hey, nobody told me that.
Yeah. But we can just see where it takes us. But Deborah, I did have one follow-up. You two were talking earlier, and I noted it when you said it before we started the event too, about how this project started as prose, or you had it in your head that it was going to be prose. And you've written, really fine essays, a book of essays, and so I'm curious about sort of when the moment was when you started to realize that oh, this is poetry, and what that how you knew that. And certainly you mentioned distillation, and poetry does that, right? Yeah, we're forced
Right.
to, but I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about that.
I'm not exactly sure, Gib, when, but I remember going back and reading all these drafts that I had. I hadn't fully drafted out a whole manuscript, but there were kernels in those that seemed so important in many of those. And actually, some of the lines in some of those essays actually became lines in some of the poems, or became prompts for poems. And I just felt like for me to get to that hard kernel and that essence of what I was trying to say, that I went to poems to see if that worked better. And the more I worked with them, they did. So I don't know exactly where in the process, but I just felt there were these individual bits that were crying out to me that I didn't feel were quite getting there. I didn't know why, but so I thought, okay, I'm going to pluck some of those out and see where that takes me. So that's kind of how that happened.
It does make sense. And I mean, if we think about, in our most intense emotions, and grief is certainly an intense emotion, poetry is often the thing that any of us reach for.
Right.
So, and sometimes that Yeah, being forced to put it through that small space.
Right. Yeah.
You know, there's an essay that Mark Strand wrote. It was an introduction to one of the best of, poetry series, probably in the early 90s, about like when people turn to poetry, and so like if somebody dies, nobody's reading the novel,
Right.
that people, even if they send a card with a rhymed sentiment in it, they're still turning to something that is like condensing some emotion or getting at something. And even if people don't think of themselves as readers of poetry, they still, that's where they'll turn. It's kind of,
Right.
it gets at the,
Yeah.
like some core in a way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think as poets, we've probably gotten requests from friends that are not all that familiar with poetry, and they ask for recommendations of poems for a wedding or an event or perhaps a funeral. And it's interesting that does seem to be where people turn.
Right.
All those poems that were written after 9/11
Mhm.
and all the great poems that are coming out of or will come out of the pandemic. I mean, really, that is so essential.
And some of the books that you mentioned that are just those collections of poems that crystallize grief. I mean, that Marie
Yeah.
Howe book, I've
And in
recommended.
different ways. I mean,
Yeah.
Jane Mead's book is very unconventional. And Ed Hirsch's whole book's about his son, but at times it becomes very narrative with really long lines.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're all different, but yeah.
All right. So a question for both of you.
Okay.
And one that I think folks will be interested to hear you each talk about, which is just, and maybe a simple one, but how do poems appear for you? How do you know? When do you realize, oh, I might be writing a poem? Whether it's in your head or you've scratched out some notes on a piece of paper, or you're, downshifting the car or whatever it is. And I'm sure it happens different ways, but
Right. Yeah.
what's some of the most common ways that happens for you?
You want to go first? You want me to go first, and you can think of your answer, since it's your show. So I'll just open with a comment.
Okay.
Well, I think in some ways it's like if I'm not writing, then I'm not writing.
Mm.
And if I begin to write, then the rest of it comes to me. It's like I've opened up, like, so that's when I'm shifting, or I'm going for a bike ride. Then the next, something will come because I've kind of requested it, by starting the process of writing. Then it opens up things that I hadn't even considered. An image will come to me, but it's actually the getting going is what starts it.
So are you riding your bike or going for a run after you've started a poem, or that's where the germ comes from?
Usually like after I've started. If I'm writing or thinking about a thing, and then there's a kind of, your mind's not on it directly, so it's actually on it more directly. I find those are, but if I don't start the actual writing,
right,
it's like when people, artists will say, well, I just got to get in the studio. Well, go there. It's like,
right.
Then with writing, the way to do it is to start it. But I think for me to stick with it, write all the time sometimes is not as helpful as beginning the action, and then letting less conscious things enter in too.
Yeah. I think that's pretty true for me. I keep a notebook. I can't say it's a journal, just a notebook. And sometimes it's just things I write in it while I'm reading something, or a bit of something I overhear. There's 2 poems in this collection that sometimes a phrase or something comes to me and it sticks in my head. And one of the poems in the book is titled "If a House Had Eyes." And I woke up one morning with that phrase. I don't know where it came from, but if a house had eyes, and it just kind of sat there with me for a while. And then sometime later that morning, second part of it came, and became the second line of the poem. If a house had eyes, then it would want hands. And that was just like so bizarre to me. I had to explore it. So that's when I sat down and started writing it. There's another poem in the book titled Where's Your Hammer, Dad? And that was when I was out in Arizona after my mother's death, and I was helping my father with a lot of things at the house. And I was in the house and he was out in the yard doing something. I remember shouting out the window to him. I needed to do something in the house. Where's your hammer, Dad? He couldn't hear me. And I repeated it over and over. Where's your hammer, Dad? And somehow that stuck in my head and then became the title and led to a poem. So sometimes they can just be things like that, these little weird things that just start. But once they start, I'm like you, I have to sit down and write, work on it.
Those are great answers. All right, so we've got time for maybe one or two more, but I'm also wondering, we are all currently trying to survive a pandemic and an election season, and lots of other things as well. I won't give the full list. But I'm wondering for each of you what you're doing to keep your head about you and your heart about you. How are you continuing to try to be creative, pay attention? I don't know, breathe. What are some things that you're doing just on a week to week or day to day basis to do that?
Well, for me, I have one essential thing, and it's this book and preparing for these Zoom things and, getting requests. But in terms of, I'm not doing a lot of new writing right now. Writing in my notebook, I'm doing a lot of reading, not just poetry, but a lot of prose. I take walks. For me, walks and being able to be outdoors and, just being able to appreciate life again, and try to stay away from too many distractions. It's hard. It's really, really hard not to feel despair at times. And it's difficult because, we can't see our family. They live far away. But yeah, I think reading and taking walks, cooking, those kinds of things, I guess, working in the garden, which maybe aren't so different than normal, but they just take on more importance.
Absolutely. Those ordinary.
Yeah. And trying to feel like there's some order, in one's own life.
Yeah. What about you, Stu?
I have to remind myself in the morning not to turn the radio on, even though I like radio. There's a certain, I realize I already know the news, so I'm only going to hear more of the news that I know, and to try to, even though there are times when we want to know what's going on, there's an inner way of knowing what's going on that you can lose when you're outer. So I guess just trying to keep that inner flame going. I also, to give you a plug, took a workshop in the lyrical essay through the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, which is a great organization, which is actually making this reading possible, which supports everything I've done as Poet Laureate. And if you're not a member and you're a writer, you should be. And if you just want to support a great organization that's been so agile during this time of being able to do readings and workshops, support them. And I also noticed somebody had a question about where to buy the book. Yeah. And you can get it at Longfellow Books. You can, I guess, just go to the website and order it.
Yep.
That was a plug for you, both of you. Yeah.
Thank you.
That great plug. We didn't pay him to say that, I swear.
Right. And I have to say a lot of the agility that you have praised MWPA for is really due to Gib and the very strong staff that we have, notably Taryn and Hannah. And gosh, you guys have really stepped up to the plate.
Thank you. Well, this is wonderful, and it's great to hear you two talk. I could listen for a lot longer, but we are at about an hour, so I think we should wrap it up, I think we've been doing something that I feel great about, and I hope other people do too, which is, after an event like this at Longfellow Books, where we all at Longfellow Books, we would have a nice moment of applause. So I would like to invite everybody on the call here to go to gallery view, unmute yourself, and applaud. Let's applaud. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining us. It's great to see all your.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. It was
Thank you.
terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Stu and
Thanks,
Dib.
Gibson. Thanks, Deborah. I
Thank
love
you.
reading your
you.
book.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, everybody.